So the next part of today's webinar is walking you through an example of the value of having an up-to-date FarmX file for clients that you're working with. And we're also going to run through a few different scenario options for an example farm that we've got set up. So this particular farm is based in the Hawke's Bay. It's not a real farm, but it is a pretty good representation of some of the systems that we see come across our desk on the help desk each day. So we're going to walk you through updating the FarmX file. This particular farm is sort of a couple of months behind on their updates, so we're going to add in some pasture covers and sort of represent where a lot of farms are at the moment with low covers from obviously the drought that's going on in many parts of the country. And we're also going to look at some mitigation options to sort of lift our pasture cover forecast up so that we've got sufficient feed heading into winter. So to give you some brief background on this particular farm system so that you've got a good idea on why we're taking the approach to the scenarios we're going to do. This is a 850 hectare effective property. We've got that split between a 650 hectare hill block and a 200 hectare flats block. And we've got three main stock enterprises on the farm. So the big one is our traditional sort of sheep breeding enterprise. We are taking, like I say, a pretty traditional approach here. So we've got our regular mixed age ewe flock, we've got our replacement hoggets, we've got our replacement ewe lambs. And in terms of what happens with the ram lambs, basically everything is fattened, and any surplus ewe lambs that aren't to be kept as replacements are also fattened. So that's the sheep enterprise we're working with. We've got about 7,000 ewes or so in this particular example. And the second enterprise we've got is bull beef. So this is a reasonably standard sort of Frisian bull beef type system. We're purchasing in calves at around 100 kilos in November and taking them through basically about 12 or 14 months and selling them store in January. So those two enterprises are relatively fixed. We can be a little bit flexible with the number of Frisian calves that we buy and that sort of thing. But in this particular example, we've already purchased our calves back in November. So the most flexible enterprise that we've still got sort of levers to pull going into winter is actually our winter lambs enterprise. So traditionally, this property purchases in around 2,500 lambs in April heading into winter. And we're going to basically see what we can still get away with less pasture cover than we'd kind of initially planned on because of the drought. So that's a bit of background on the farm system. Next, we're going to get into doing two sort of main updates. So we're going to assume for this particular property that our stock information is relatively up to date, and we're just going to add in some pasture covers to sort of simulate a drought scenario. And a common example that you are probably working on with clients at the moment. So back in January, as you'll see, the farm pasture cover looked like it was tracking quite well, but then we sort of hit a wall in February and March. So we're going to add in those pasture cover measurements from February and March to get this file up to date. And the February cover we're going to add in, so this is just an average farm cover at the end of the month, is 1350. You'll see that pulls our pasture cover forecast for the rest of the season down. And as we add in our end of March cover, it's actually going to do the same thing. So we were hoping to be around a 1,500 cover at this time. That was our initial forecast, but it's been very dry, and we're right down at a 1,300 or so cover average at the end of March. And you'll see that that has done a bit of damage to our forecast for June. So our June cover is now forecast to be right down at 1,000 kilos if we make no changes, getting very, very low. So we're going to go through and look at some different mitigation options essentially. So we're going to look at three main scenarios to lift that pasture cover, and the bare bones sort of cover that we want going into winter is right around 1,300 as an average. So still not a huge cover. We're probably on ice still a little bit there, but that's the target we're going to set for today, just to show you as an example how we would go about modeling those systems. So in this particular example, like I say, we're going through three different scenarios. The first one is going to be applying nitrogen to our flats block, and probably combining that with still purchasing in fewer winter lambs than the 2,500 that we'd initially planned. The second scenario is going to be around purchasing in palm kernel, so purchasing in palm kernel to essentially feed to our bulls so that we can free up some pasture to, again, feed to those winter lambs. Again, we're probably still going to have to pull back the winter lamb numbers slightly to still make things work. And the third example is going to be just pulling back our winter lamb numbers. So not applying nitrogen, not buying an extra feed, just purely dialing back the scale that we were looking at with that trading enterprise through winter. So in order to create a scenario, I've come back to the cloud window. You can get there just by clicking open. And we're going to right click on monitoring, hit duplicate, and create a new scenario. So this is going to give us our monitoring file as a base to work on to model some changes to that initial plan. And the first one we're going to look at is adding nitrogen and finishing less winter lambs. So the process for a lot of these scenarios is going to be pretty similar. The first thing we're going to do in all of these scenarios is grab our pasture cover screen. So you can get that by clicking the little pop-out button above print. And next we're going to go ahead and add in our nitrogen event. So for this particular farm, we can basically get nitrogen across the entire flats block pretty easily. And we're going to put pretty much 40 kilos of nitrogen across that entire block and see how much that can lift our pasture cover forecast for the end of June. So as we add this in, you should see that cover forecast change. Has lifted up slightly. If we look to the end of June, that number is quite small, but hopefully you're seeing that now. We've got an average farm cover forecast of about 1140 at the moment. So we're going to go in next and continue to dial back the stock demand. So we're going to purchase in less lambs, and you should see that pasture cover forecast for the end of June continue to lift up. And our target in this particular scenario is to land on right around 1300. So to get to that 1300 cover, it's looked like we're going to have to drop our lamb numbers right down to about 1400 lambs being purchased in. And that's the scenario all done. So we're not going to look at too much of the results just yet. We're going to actually go in and model those other two options first, and then we can go ahead and compare the scenarios against each other. So same process for creating this next scenario. We're going to right click on monitoring back in that open welcome cloud window, and this one is going to be called by palm kernel and less lambs. So like I said earlier, we're going to feed some palm kernel to the bulls. In this particular scenario, we're going to go for about 50 ton of palm kernel and see what that does to the system. So just like in the first scenario, we're going to grab that pasture cover screen. So again, going into pasture covers, clicking the little pop-out button above pasture covers, above print, and then head to supplements. So we're going to go into supplements, add in palm kernel. If you are doing this model in practice with a client, you can of course go in behind the scenes and have a look at the price assumptions and so on for palm kernel. For this example, we're just going to keep it simple and kind of leave it as the default numbers just to walk you through it. So we're purchasing in 50 ton here, as you can see. We're then going to feed that out over the next few months. So 10 ton fed in April and 20 ton fed in each of the 2 months after that. So you'll see that's pulled our pasture cover back up a little bit. We're back up to about 1100 or so as our forecast for the end of June. But we're still not at that 1300 that we need to get to. So again, we're going to go back and dial back that purchase of winter lambs from the 2,500 and kind of just keep pulling it down slightly until we get that cover forecast right where we need it. So in this case, it looks like we're going to land on right about 1,150 lambs or 1,100 lambs. That's going to get us in the right spot. And again, that's that scenario all done. So some relatively straightforward changes here, but these are obviously having big impacts on the business, which we'll go through and look at shortly. But first, we're going to run our third and final scenario before we go ahead and compare the three. So same process again. We're going to right click on monitoring in that cloud window, duplicate it, and this final scenario is just simply purchasing in less lambs. So we're not going to add in any extra feed. We're not going to apply any extra N. We're not going to make any other changes other than just dialing back that trading enterprise through winter. So same process, we're going to head to pasture covers, pop that screen out by clicking the pop-out button above print, and then heading into the winter lambs purchase event and dialing back some of the numbers. So you'll see we've still got the 2,500 in there because that's what was sitting in our monitoring file as the initial plan. And again, same process. We're just going to keep dialing this back, and we'll see our pasture cover respond to that. We'll see our pasture cover forecast move up because there's less stock demand being budgeted for in the system because of less lambs. And we'll see what we can basically get away with while still getting to that 1,300 cover kind of bare bones target. So in this particular case, we're seeing, since we haven't added in any extra feed, we're having to pull our lamb numbers right back from 2,500 all the way down to about 600. So pretty dramatic change there, but it'll be interesting to see what the results look like between these three scenarios. So does it make sense to purchase in that feed? Does it make sense to apply that fertilizer? That's kind of the question we're trying to answer here. So the final step to go ahead and actually compare these and see some of the results is to close out of that final scenario, click open and head back to our cloud window. And then what you can do is you can hold control on your keyboard, highlight all three of those different scenarios, and then open them all up at once. And what opening them all up at once does is it allows us to get a new set of reports called compare reports. And these are basically going to allow us to stack up all the three different options next to each other and look at some of the results. So we can see which one is most profitable. We can see what the pasture covers look like, the supply demand curves, all those different bits of information that you'll want to use in your analysis to obviously provide recommendations to your clients. So first, we've just gone in to look at the profit and loss here so that we can stack up some of the financial differences between these scenarios. And there's a couple of key areas that you're going to want to look at here. So the main one on the revenue side of this equation for these scenarios is going to be actually the capital value of sheep. So we haven't made any changes to our sheep breeding or to our bull beef enterprises. The main change we've made is obviously that winter lambs purchase in terms of purchases and sales of stock. So what that is going to show up as in our profit and loss report is simply a capital value change. So we've purchased the lambs in, but we get to sell them. So that's just going to show up as having more stock on hand at the end of the season, and there will be a value applied to those animals through this profit and loss report. So you'll see that as capital value. In terms of the expense changes, we're obviously going to have nitrogen incorporated in for the scenario where we added nitrogen. So you should see about $17,000 or so in this example coming through for nitrogen. And we've got about $18,500 coming in as an expense for palm kernel in that scenario. So those are some of the different expense changes and revenue changes. And from that, we can get an overall indication of how those changes affect our profit and loss and which option looks like the most profitable option out of those three to lift that cover and get to where we need to. So in this case, the additional nitrogen and a few less lambs looks like the best option. Not massive differences between these three. We have seen differences of tens of thousands of dollars in some of the scenarios that people are running. So they can definitely provide some pretty significant insights. But in this case, we've got the additional nitrogen and a few less lambs looking like the winner by about $5,000 to $10,000 versus the other two options. So that's the profit and loss. You can also look at things like pasture cover and supply demand. So with pasture cover, we're probably not going to see too many differences between the scenarios in this case. And that's because we basically intentionally tried to line up that 1,300 target between each of the different options. So that's what you're going to see there. We've also got some supply demand reporting so you can get a feel for how it changes the supply demand equations in the background for these farm systems. And hopefully all of this information combined gives you a really good picture of where the farm is currently at when we added in those pasture covers, where they were heading with their initial plan, and where they have the ability to still kind of pull levers and correct their course to still remain as profitable as they possibly can, even through hard situations such as the drought. So that's our example for today. The final part of today's webinar is answering your questions. So if you have got any questions, feel free to fire away and we'll try and answer them as best we can.